Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, Shadowproof Managing Editor. I'm pleased to be here joining you to provide a report on what was the final day of evidence in Julian Assange's extradition trial. And we know from the judge who made the announcement at the end of proceedings that the decision will be coming on January 4th, 2021. That's January 4th, 2021. And over these months, they are going to, she will be putting together her decision. And I want to say that this is all going rather formally. I do not see some invisible hand that is manipulating this process. There is a lot that has gone on in the proceedings. There's a lot of evidence that has been presented about how the U.S. government has unfairly prejudiced this case that they are bringing against Julian Assange, but I see no evidence at the time that she is in fact allowing the politics of the Trump administration to steer the way that she schedules the decision in this matter. It's just the fact that it has taken a long time. I go back to the fact that we were supposed to have this trial in May, but the COVID-19 pandemic delayed it. And so then we had a 1 month of evidence presented with dozens of witnesses that were called to take the stand, many of them remotely. It was cumbersome at times to do the testimony. And then we wrapped up today on October 1st, what was day 18. And we lost a couple days due to a scare that perhaps the prosecutor had come down with COVID. It turned out to be fine. Though the pandemic has been spiking during this trial, we made it through. And they have had to increase and reestablish and make sure that social distancing was followed inside the courthouse. I've covered this remotely, so they had to accommodate journalists who were not at the courthouse, and they've also had to deal with a fresh extradition request the defense has, scrambling for how to respond to that. And the judge had to deal with the fact that this just was not a normal situation in which she found herself. And so I'm not trying to give her sympathy. I'm just trying to tell you that I see conspiracy where conspiracies might actually have evidence for existing, and I haven't seen the evidence here. And I've seen it suggested that there was a political decision to provide this extradition determination after the U.S. election day. It was agreed by the defense and the judge that they wanted more time. They wanted 4 more weeks for closing argument. And so it would have been impossible to get this decision before the election day. They asked for 4 more weeks to put on the best defense for Julian Assange, to put together their closing argument, and then the prosecution will have 2 weeks to come up with a reply to that closing argument or put together their closing argument based on what the defense is submitting. The defense will then have 72 hours to answer anything they would like in the prosecution's submission. And then all of that, all those closing arguments go to the judge. It's all done. There's nothing further provided by either side. And she is in her chambers and she is working on this from the first week, second week of November, all the way through into December. And she's putting together the decision on the extradition request. And then we will get the announcement on January 4th. So as more people are joining, I want to thank you up top for supporting my work throughout all of this. I'm going to be expressing my gratitude throughout this final report that I give here on the extradition trial. This journalism, what I've done for the last month, would not have been possible without you, especially it would have been difficult without knowing there are people here who engage with this every day. I get good questions from people. So if you have any questions from from following the proceedings over the last week or so, and you would like to have them addressed, I'm happy to answer. And if you have anything to put to me, if you disagree with something I'm saying and want to provoke debate, I think that's fine too. We have reached the conclusion of the proceedings, and so I'll likely make this announcement a couple times. But at first, while I have certain people here who are going to be following early and may leave towards the end of the broadcast, I'd like to make sure everyone knows that there is a live event on October 3rd that will be done. And it was scheduled so we could reach a massive audience globally. I co-organized this with Juan Passarelli, the filmmaker, and it's called Julian Assange's Extradition Trial and the War on Journalism. This is an independent media roundtable discussion. I wanted to gather all of these wonderful journalists that I've come in contact with while working on the Assange case over the past year, including on this trial. But some of them I met back in February when I traveled to London to cover the 1-week legal argument hearing that took place. And so we are going to gather these 8 journalists together. It's a mega panel. It's extremely difficult to have so many people in a span of 2 hours. These are good voices who deserve a platform. We've all been defying the establishment or corporate media blackout on this case. Although I suppose we have to qualify that blackout. There have been aspects of the trial that make it into the headlines. You're just not getting daily sustained coverage that gives a complete understanding of what is unfolding with the extradition trial. To the credit of UK media yesterday, they published headlines about the UC Global witnesses and focused on the discussions with US intelligence operatives about poisoning Julian Assange and also plotting to kidnap him from the embassy. And that is a fantastic headline, and I'm glad that it got focus. I have to add for context that this was spoken about and part of the February hearing in 2020. And we could have, if this had been more focused on by those outlets back then, if they made a whole deal out of it, perhaps it might have benefited Julian Assange. I can't really say how. But it's good that on the day that we heard evidence, that's something that they wanted to focus on. And there wasn't a whole lot of new detail, although I outlined it because we hadn't heard it from the perspectives of these 2 witnesses in full. And it was important, I think, to describe some of the efforts by the IT expert in particular to undermine what the US government was trying to do to Julian Assange. But we knew a lot of this information. It's been covered in the Spanish newspaper El País and by the Gray Zone. And so I have to say, I was reminded of the power of the establishment or corporate press yesterday. When they put this out there, suddenly everyone was like, this is fact, this has happened. And I had known that this had happened for many months. At least a half of this year, I have known that this was something that was discussed. But now a mass of people around the world know, and I hope that affects this positively. I hope that brings people over to recognizing some of the abuses in this case. And I think, all of us in the independent media, this is what we are doing. We're trying to break out and make sure more people are aware of the work that's being done before the corporate or establishment media finally gets to it, because often they get to it late. We'll get to it first, and then as it starts to become clear that it's not controversial, they will go and talk about some of these things. So to answer Sally's question, she's asking, will the October 3rd panel on this Julian Assange's extradition trial, will that be posted to this channel? Yes, it's going to stream live at Shadowproof's YouTube. Shadowproof is hosting it. I'm hosting it. I'm co-hosting it with Juan Passarelli, and you'll be able to find it here. And so let's get into some of what happened today. Today was chaotic, but I do want to give a full wrap up of what happened with the final day. It was, I didn't realize that we weren't going to get anything from court proceedings until the afternoon, but it took some time. They were haggling over statements that were to be put in the record by Gareth Pierce, who is on Assange's legal team, and they needed to go back and forth over this material. And she had 6 statements in total, I think, or 5 statements. And then she also had something that was drafted related to a part of the indictment that has been expanded. So in that fresh indictment, they've added more general allegations related to the conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. And I'll get to that. I want to talk about that because the judge rejected their effort to make a submission to provide her more information about their objections to this this expansion of the indictment. And so as this started, we got statements from Gareth Pierce that were being read. Oh, we also had a statement from Michael Tiggar that was finally agreed upon. And he is a professor, an attorney who has done work on national security and human rights cases. He offered a rundown of the history of journalism for the judge and outlined some of the problems with overclassification and delved into some other issues. I think, it could be somewhat useful to the judge, but I will say that we had heard a lot of this from Trevor Timm and Mark Feldstein in the first week of proceedings. So I don't know if Tiggar was supposed to testify during that week, and then there was a logistical issue. The COVID scare did throw things off, and maybe they skipped around and decided they would come back to Michael Tiggar later. But finally, his statement entered into the record and available to the judge now. We had multiple statements talking about the issues with asylum, the evidence of UC Global spying. This is what Pierce was dealing with. She was going over some of the evidence of surveillance as it pertained to the embassy, getting that into the record. Then there was a second statement that was really important, and I think yes, the date of the decision, when it is going to becoming. I think the media is going to make this the headline. The headline from the massive media is going to be, the more mainstream networks will be, that we now have a date. They love that. That's great for them. It's a simple, clean thing, and they love publishing announcement style reports. But there were things that happened today that do deserve coverage alone, beyond just the fact that we know when this decision is coming. And we heard in the second statement how they were dealing with the legally privileged material that was seized from the embassy, and what they were doing about that. The fact that they were invited to go, the firm that Gareth Pierce is with was invited to go collect the remaining possessions. And they found that, quote, all the legally privileged material was missing, save for some court documents. I heard Supreme Court. It could have been a court in the UK, or it could have been the Supreme Court in the United States. I'm not entirely sure. I hope to be able to read this particular statement so that I can have the clear quote for my coverage that I'll be putting out. There were specific files and materials that they list in this so that the judge can see that this is material that the U.S. government or U.S. intelligence agencies have potentially accessed, undermining the due process or the kind of fairness that is supposed to exist in these proceedings. So then there was a statement that Pierce put in related to Assange's political opinions and political philosophy. We get another proceeding about domestic proceedings. I think this may or may not have had to do with what was going on in the UK. We get more to do with the embassy and the Spanish case, and some more related to how Baltazar Garzón was targeted by UC Global with the support of U.S. intelligence. And Pierce importantly says that Julian Assange had had suspected that there were intrusions on the embassy, that this total surveillance was happening. But obviously now this evidence that we have has confirmed these suspicions. And generally, as a consequence, she said there's an exceptionally high level of anxiety and a fear that Assange's conversations with his attorneys continue to be monitored. I suppose that would also include at the Belmarsh prison, that perhaps those are being collected. So we don't have any proof, we don't have any evidence, but from what they've gone through, that's the anxiety of what they are feeling. And Garzón was followed. Baltazar Garzón, former Spanish judge on the Assange legal team, was followed and photographed. This has affected the confidence of Assange's lawyers as a whole on how they are able to keep these matters confidential in the case. And Gordon Kromberg, the assistant U.S. attorney, who has always had some words to try and bail out and help the prosecution in this case justify their case, has anything that might come up that's abuses of process, or anytime they need rationalization of cruelty in the United States prison system, they've fallen back on this assistant U.S. attorney from the Eastern District of Virginia. And he says any material that has come from the embassy that could prejudice the accused is going to be subject to a taint team excision. So there's going to be a team called the taint team that's going to look at all of the evidence, and it's hard to keep a straight face because it sounds silly. And they're all going to go over this material, and we're supposed to trust that they're not going to use anything that should not have been taken from Julian Assange that was legally privileged, which is really hard to believe. I don't find their reassurances that good. So we go on. There's some more from Pierce that was entered into the record. And then eventually we get a update from the lawyer, Aitor Martinez, who is representing, who is involved in the criminal case against David Morales in Spain, bringing these charges of violations. And he mentions in his update that the Spanish government, or I say the Spanish judiciary, is now investigating the IP addresses that had access to the UC Global server. And there might be judicial findings, there may be developments in that case that the court hearing this extradition, the British court, that the judge, Vanessa Baretzer, should take notice of, that could be of relevance. I don't know if she's going to be able to take note of those while she's making her decision. But if something big would develop, we know that the defense will probably try to get the judge to incorporate that into her decisions if there's some major revelation. But trying to find the identities of the people behind those IP addresses, we know that the Spanish court has asked for the U.S. government to provide some information. They said, well, sure, but you have to reveal to us the identities of these people who are from UC Global, who are involved in blowing the whistle on our operation. And of course, that is a pretty sinister kind of a request to make, because you're trying to force people to put themselves at risk in order to pursue justice, which they may not want to do since they're under armed protection, and they believe that David Morales, who has Marine experience in Spain could retaliate against them. So then we had more of the proceeding as it concluded and wrapped. It was a lot of argument and contentious back and forth over some papers, material that really isn't that significant in the entire scheme of the trial, but could be perhaps useful to finessing the argument that the defense wants to make in their closing. And the judge rejected an effort to submit material that relates to the allegations that were added in the fresh extradition request. So they wanted to put in something that had to do with the statutory scheme and the legal. And so they were denied the ability to do that. I'm laughing at the reactions to taint team. Yes. So I want to just bring something to all of your attention before I go and answer these questions and conclude this final report. And again, as I started the broadcast, thank you all for your support of this work. Many of you have made donations to Shadowproof, making this work possible. Some of you, I'm sure, will make donations after and in the future, making sure that this journalism continues and will continue, especially around the decision in January. And I thank all of you. So what I want to say is that I brought attention on September 25th, which was before the weekend on the Friday. And this was after we heard Patrick Eller's testimony. And Patrick Eller was the digital forensic expert with a U.S. Army background who did an excellent job deconstructing and unraveling the password cracking conspiracy theory that has been leveled or was put forward to explain what they believe Julian Assange did with Chelsea Manning. And I showed that the evolution of this case reflects the fact that this charge that was understood by the press as a hacking charge, I put the hacking and some really energetic air quotes because I mean that it's not hacking as even really the U.S. government has claimed. It's trying to help somebody. If they could even prove it, they would be able to move about a network anonymously, which to me isn't really hacking. If they have access and you are able to then access that anonymously, I mean, I don't know if it really changes your access, although I realize this is something for legal debate in courts. But the point that I want to make here is that in 2018, Julian Assange was accused of violating 3 provisions of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and committing conspiracy to defraud U.S. government. And then, and this was under seal, this was what the grand jury returned. This is what the grand jury returned even as they were still trying to claim that they needed to force Chelsea Manning to testify before the grand jury, although they didn't need her in order to issue an indictment. And she was jailed and abusively mistreated for a year and attempted to commit suicide. So very nearly killed herself in the Alexandria Detention Center over what they were doing to her. It was cruel and they never needed her testimony. But they issued this charge. And then in 2019, the charge changed. The charge in the superseding indictment was conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, and then as I continue, it was no longer specifically charged. So what they had done in 2018 is they had pointed out how they exactly believed Julian Assange had violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But then when they issued the Espionage Act offenses, they no longer were as clear about what they believed Julian Assange had did. It was a bit more general. If you look at the charge sheet, this is how it changes. And then you get to 2020, and it just says it's a generic conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. I looked at this, and it points out that they think elements of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act were violated, but they're only charging him under this conspiracy law that has been on the books for decades, well before the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And so why does this matter? Why am I taking you through this? It's because the way that the defense has understood this charge has changed. In this indictment that was issued and served on them in July, they only really got to look at it very clearly and see it in July. This was a month and a half before the extradition trial. It has changed. There are now general allegations of conspiracy that don't really need to be proven as it relates to computer crime. It is all about whether Julian Assange conspired to defraud the U.S. government. Well, what does that mean? That seems like a political offense, conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. What does that mean? Anything that he did that they believe would disrupt the normal function of the U.S. government can be treated as conspiracy to defraud. Conversations with people who were involved in obtaining hacked materials, passing that material on to him, having those communications with those individuals, that's conspiracy to defraud, even though we have a First Amendment right to publish hacked materials that has been recognized by a court recently because the Democratic National Committee sued and were shot down by Judge Gosztola in the Southern District of New York, I believe is where that happened, because they were going after WikiLeaks for their role in the publication of the Podesta emails. And he said, no, that is covered by the First Amendment. We have a right to publish hacked materials under the First Amendment. And so he recognized that for WikiLeaks. But now what the government is doing is saying these conversations, these communications, this is how I interpret it. They're saying that just the conspiracy, the formation of agreements with these people, and again, encouraging people to leak classified information, that's conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. And this is a fundamentally different offense than a password cracking charge. Password cracking goes out of we don't anymore have to really worry about that. The prosecutors are telling the judge, we don't have to prove that anything happened that was criminal between Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, because they've expanded this charge to cover 2009 to 2015, and anything they can fling that might stick and be persuasive to the judge is going to be what they believe proves conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. They would not have made the same argument on this charge that they are going to make to the judge if they had given that argument back in May, because they filed the indictment after the originally scheduled extradition trial. So I hope I've adequately communicated that there is something going on here that is unfair, and it is something that's an abuse of the process. I think under the extradition treaty, this is not how it is supposed to go between the United States government and the UK government, although the Crown Prosecution Authority is allowing it and may even be in on it. And this is largely going to be dealt with on appeal because the judge won't do anything about it at this stage. So presuming that the extradition is approved, they will deal with it after that. So let me get to some questions. I went on a bit longer, but I realized, so Stella has made a statement. Thank you, Haza, for notifying me. I will look for Stella's statement later. Thank you, Lima. You say your professional coverage has been critical. I cannot wait for the event. It's going to be brilliant. Yes, thank you. I hope everyone enjoys the October 3rd event that will be coming. And other questions. If Judge Baretzer decides to extradite Mr. Assange to the U.S., is there any chance a non-biased judge will preside over the appeal? I suppose it's a bit of a loaded question in the sense that judges have institutional biases no matter what. So there's always going to be a biased judge. I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a non-biased judge. Judges are pretty much captives of the branch in which they work, and they show a lot of deference to the executive branch, especially on matters that involve pretrial confinement and then sentencing, and how people are sent to different facilities where they will be held to serve out their sentences. They have to defer to what the executive is doing. Some laws are written that say they have to allow certain measures to be imposed on detainees as well as prisoners. So that's one aspect that I think the bias will come into play, where Julian Assange would have his due process rights violated, but then they also know the case law and how it has been handled in these cases, that Julian Assange can't make a public interest defense, and there isn't going to be an activist judge who will show up to save Julian Assange and make sure he gets to actually defend himself against this unprecedented prosecution. So I think we're really in for something quite dangerous in the way it will set precedents if a trial happens with Julian Assange in the United States. Obviously, we have a lot of time to go before that would be a possibility, but I have my extreme doubts about what the judge would be able to do for Julian Assange, given the power the prosecutors have to go after Julian Assange with Espionage Act offenses. Natalia says, the Mexican media has been quiet and indifferent about this, so thank you for your coverage. I've enjoyed so much your participation in the Action for Assange coverage too. Thank you so much. And a shout to Action for Assange for the streaming that they have done. These are grassroots activists who care about Julian Assange and have been doing some fine work. They haven't had access to the proceedings like me, so they've been bringing on people to talk about the coverage that they've been reading and seeing. And they've done a good job really early. One of the hosts, he's out in California and goes to work after doing this. I believe he's getting up at like 1 o'clock in the morning, or was getting up at 1 o'clock in the morning for these last weeks to do this streaming. So a lot of credit for doing all of that, for working a job and doing live streaming on this case. Actually, both of them have jobs, so they're doing the streaming and they're going to work. And then I see another question here. Is there any chance a non-biased... Okay, you're responding to Dottie. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Julian should countersue against the U.S. government. Okay. And all right, finally, so is the panel that considers an appeal in the UK going to be equally compromised as is Baretzer? I do think that the appeal would go better for Julian Assange, especially when the panel has more than one judge, so you get multiple opinions rather than having it be left up to one judge. But you know what? These people who are on these courts don't look favorably on what WikiLeaks has done. That's clear. And it's really hard to get a good ruling. And it's not a terrorism case, but on some days you think it might as well be, because he certainly seems to have some of the same problems that people do who are accused of terrorism offenses. Do you think the hard push by judge to announce her decision on January 4th has anything to do with our presidential election outcome and how? I don't. I think everything has been mostly normal about the scheduling. And I realize that there is a lot of conversation out there about how waiting until 2021 is some kind of in some way related to the election. But following the proceedings, this is what was agreed between the defense and the judge. As I said earlier in the stream, this was agreed between both of them. The defense wants more time. If they wanted to wrap this up, they could scramble and get a closing argument in, or not submit a closing argument if they wanted to beat the election day. But it was always going to be impossible because we did this trial in September and there's not enough time. You can't get a decision in a month. These things don't work at this pace. It doesn't even work at that pace in the United States. Court decisions come slowly. And at least I guess we should be fortunate. We should be happy that it's not going to take 6 months or even a year. Sometimes it can take really long in some of these more sensitive cases, especially ones involving national security, for people to get anything announced in the U.S. So I've seen Freedom of Information Act cases or other cases that take a long time. All right. So, yeah, well, don't make fun of him. Heart is in the right place. I appreciate the question. What is the best way to support you? And while the obvious answer does appear to be based on the banner on the screen, shadowproof.com/donate, I will take this moment as I am wrapping to give you all a bit of an idea of what I'm going to be doing after this trial and invite you to continue to follow my work, especially those of you who may have been introduced to my journalism for the first time. So the Dissenter Newsletter is something that will continue. I won't be sending out reports every single day because I won't have new news. There won't be a trial anymore. But I will be doing a newsletter where there's a free report every week on whistleblower issues, whistleblower stories, and there will also be WikiLeaks updates that could be covered. And I'll do 3 reports every week, and 2 of those are going to go to the people who are able to support me and be paid subscribers. So if you can, it's a $5 a month newsletter, $5 for 1 month, and you'll get 2 to 3 reports every week that cover whistleblower and also updates on WikiLeaks. And I really encourage you to support that journalism. This is what I'm dedicated to covering. And I have a companion show weekly on Thursdays that takes place at about 4 p.m. Eastern. I have a companion show on Thursdays called the Dissenter Weekly, where I do this live stream and go through whistleblower stories from the past week, and I give updates on WikiLeaks. And in the time from now until the decision is announced in January 2021, I'll be covering aspects of the trial that maybe were overlooked or glossed over that we need further coverage of so that we can understand all the important developments that that transpired in this last month. We're going to have lots of time to figure out what this extradition trial may mean for press freedom and the war on journalism. And that's why I'm holding this event with Juan Passarelli and the other journalists who have done fantastic work. And I want you to be exposed to their hard work that they've done. And nobody was omitted. Nobody was left out. This is a fairly big panel. And, I arrived at these 8 people to be gathered. And we've got Tariq Haddad, Mohammed El-Mazi, Mary Kastakidis, and Richard Medhurst, and Joe Loria at Consortium News, and all of these people, and Taylor Hudak. And I probably left somebody out, but on the announcement that I'm sharing, everyone is listed. And this is going to be a fantastic panel to have gathered to discuss and go over what was the most stunning developments of the past month. What does this all mean to us? And how should we view it going forward in the scheme of a wider war on journalism that is being perpetrated by Donald Trump's administration and the wider U.S. government? Not just Donald Trump himself, but the very U.S. intelligence institutions that claim to be part of a democracy, that try to promote it and impose imperial authority over countries around the world day in and day out, and profess to believe in core principles of democracy and justice, but do everything to subvert it, as is evidenced by this case and the spying operation against Julian Assange that has been exposed. So it's going to be an excellent panel. And if you don't catch it live, it will be archived and available at the Shadowproof YouTube channel for you to watch. With that said, if I was going to recommend a few things that you may have missed, I would say I was able to have the privilege of interviewing Daniel Ellsberg, and that happened in the past week. You should watch that interview with Daniel Ellsberg. His wisdom is superior when it comes to this case, especially because he's a Pentagon Papers whistleblower who testified in the extradition trial and also has a lot of knowledge about how the U.S. government has pursued people for Espionage Act violations, and constantly showing support for people who are targeted as whistleblowers. And finally, I would say I've done a couple good podcasts that definitely deserve your support and also gave me a platform. I did the Media Roots podcast with Abby Martin, and Robbie Martin had a 2-hour conversation with them. I think some of the material was available for their patrons to listen to. The first part for everybody to listen. I've done several editions of the Scott Horton show with him. He's been very good at giving me a platform to share my coverage. I did an interview with Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton for their show Moderate Rebels, and that went very well. That was very early on in the extradition trial. So those are some of the interviews I look back as highlights. And I do have a forthcoming interview that'll be published by Branko Marcetic, who is a journalist with Jacobin. And that is, of course, the magazine for democratic socialists in the United States. And I was pleased to be able to talk with him in detail about Julian Assange's case and to get that down to share with some people so that I could impress upon the left why they need to remain engaged and concerned about this case, since a lot of people have kept a distance and been reluctant to show any interest. Will the timing of the Spanish court case affect the extradition outcome? Probably not, but as I said earlier in the stream, the judge has been made aware that if there are developments in it, she may need to incorporate that into her decision. So if David Morales is found guilty, I think that's an important development that needs to be considered in the extradition case. All right, well, I've been able to do this for 18 days. I started actually in a different time zone. I wrapped up this trial in a different time zone, and it's been great to be able to talk with all of you. You're so gracious on social media and when engaging in these broadcasts. There will be much more to do, much more coverage to bring you on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. But until that time, when there are new developments to report, and until I join, and until this panel on October 3rd, with all the wonderful independent media who have been covering Julian Assange, I sign off, and I will speak with you again soon.